stay with me until the end.
The early 2000s were an interesting time for culture, but an especially interesting time for games. There was a stark shift aesthetically in the mid to late 90s where some games could be a little grittier, edgier, and just generally more abrasive if they wanted to be. Society in general was moving towards a more edgy sensibility anyway, and it's only natural that games would follow suit in a way. For every Crash Bandicoot, there'd be a Nightmare Creatures or a Kudelka there ready to throw a little grit back into the mix. And I think a lot of people look back on those days and slightly cringe about where games used to be as a medium, and sure, there are times when I look back and think that too. But we also can't look at that era and not think how it yielded some pretty cool fucking video games. But there's a specific moment, a little bubble in an interesting period of time when not only the games industry but media in general across the board would utilize a certain kind of aesthetic. This aesthetic would then find itself getting slightly warped every so often into a phase I like to call Tropical Morning Time. Is an aesthetic that utilizes beachcore, sunset equals pretty vibes, and subtly twists them around to deliver something melancholic at its core. To take something that should feel idyllic, calming, relaxing, beautiful, and find ways of making it feel a little more disconcerting. Visually, this could be done by using a beach where the sun has crossed the horizon line, making the clouds seem dark as they loom overhead, while you know that with every passing second, the light grows dimmer. This then also winds up warping the colors you may expect to associate with a beach. Warm values, oranges, yellows, and cold values like your pale and darker blues get mixed up and form shades that dance between the two. Pinks, purples, lilacs, and the little remnants of color that dance on the edges of the sky that quickly withers away as time goes on. Tropical Morning Time doesn't just have to be about warping the visual conventions of beaches and tropical vibes though. In fact, we could have an instance of a tropical location that looks exactly like you'd expect. And to strike against certain expectations, we could have a story or an element that is decidedly stressful or dealing with pretty complex emotions or subtly off-putting vibes. Let me quickly just run down the history of tropical locations in video games first to establish some kind of baseline, with the best example in my mind being Sonic Adventure. This first level is absolutely burned into my brain with how bright and colorful it all is. Then you throw in the music, the classic Sonic-isms, and sound effects, and honestly, we get a pretty perfect feeling level. Plus, it's Sonic Adventure, so it's already pretty much the best game ever made. Sonic Adventure also has the Mystic Ruins, which also feels kind of tropical coded too. And it being one of the first games I ever played that really let you explore the world like this was pretty special. And man, some of these skyboxes are just absolutely incredible. No one was able to get a blue sky like Sega was in that time. Fast forward a few years and we also have Super Mario Sunshine, the quintessential tropical themed game that a lot of people seem to be a little sour on these days. Which I guess I can understand, but I don't come here for the Mario, I come here for the colors and to play with water, because this mechanic is fun as hell. Early 2000s beach vibes are also in games like Halo, Super Monkey Ball, Kingdom Hearts, Tekken 4, there's a lot of this stuff. And every game that does feature a beach or tropical vibe for a level tends to approach it in their own way. But examples like Majora's Mask that decide to add an underlying twist to the aesthetic somewhere deep in there are what compel me. The Great Bay Area in Majora's Mask obviously utilizes the beachcore vibe, complete with a village of Zoras that like to just chill out and play smooth jazz. But the general vibes of Majora's Mask don't really let any location feel relaxing, let's be honest. The visuals of the first area are pretty normal with colors I'd expect to see on a beach like this, but wait for the sunset to arrive and we're greeted with a pretty sickly looking color palette. There's kind of a weird vibe forming now, and once the sun does set completely, we're left in a much darker, colder environment. Seeing the moon looming overhead in the background beyond, knowing that with the setting of the sun we're running out of time to save Termina, and undoing all the work we've done to help save the people of the land in this current time loop, is pretty effective stuff. Plus, it fits pretty perfectly into the core vibes of Tropical Morning Time. The common belief is that beaches are the ultimate holiday destination, the ultimate chill spot. But what about when it gets uncomfortable? When the horizon suddenly feels daunting and lacks the gentle freedom you associate with the sea? What happens when something warps your perception in ways that you may not even take much notice of if you aren't someone that's disturbed by the cosmic horrors that hang above our heads every day? Admittedly, there's a tinge of nostalgia embedded into the idea of tropical morning time too. It might just be me lamenting the ways that cool games in the 90s and the 2000s tended to share these sorts of locations in common, but of course changing up the visual aesthetic with every game. And growing up in a place that was mostly cloudy, rainy, or neither because I was just in my room all day, all the time, and rarely looked outside, it all made these sunny beaches hit a little harder for me. Anyway, one of the games that truly captures the essence of tropical morning time is Final Fantasy X. In fact, it might just be the best example. Wanna know something funny? Until a few months back, I absolutely despised Final Fantasy X. I thought it was the worst Final Fantasy I had ever played. I didn't understand what everyone else saw in it, and frankly, I thought most people that put it at the top of their lists were maybe a little blinded by nostalgia. Nowadays though, I love Final Fantasy X. I would die for Final Fantasy X. If Final Fantasy X has an ultimate fanboy, it is me. This is a perfect experience from top to bottom, and gaming would have peaked here if Metal Gear Solid 2 wasn't out in the same year. And even then, on a good day, you might squeeze out of me that Final Fantasy X is a better game. That's how much of a wife guy I've become for this thing. But we're here to talk about Final Fantasy X's aesthetics. And you have noticed by now probably that this video is mostly using footage from the PS2 version. And that's not an accident. And it's not because of anything boring like console elitism, or because I've basically pigeonholed my channel to be mildly obsessed with this incredible DVD player. It's actually because the way the console outputs the game is kind of key to its whole vibe. The PS2 release outputs at a 512 by 416 resolution, and if that's wrong, blame Google, it's the number I'm seeing right now. Couple that resolution with motion blur, lots of wavy effects, and a dimmer overall mood, and we get everything that makes this game work visually. Final Fantasy X, like a lot of PS2 games played on modern televisions, is a pretty hazy game visually speaking. The blur though acts as this very nice softening layer to the overall visual palette. And we can sit here and say that this sort of look wasn't intentional, and that if this game was made 20 years later, it'd be in HD. And guess what?
Of course!
Yeah, that's obviously how it would be done. Why would you purposely make a game run at a lower resolution for artistic effect? Well, maybe that's what we should be doing anyway, that's what I'm saying. The tropical morning time aesthetic, in my mind, sacrifices visual fidelity and objective crispness for a hazy look that obfuscates detail at times, creating scenes where the focus isn't on specific objects or places, but more on the wider image in general. Focus on the whole of the scene rather than what's in the scene specifically. Kind of like an abstraction of what we're looking at in a way, I suppose, which I don't think is intentional on the part of the developers, and I'd argue that it's not something that any game from this era intends to do. But we're looking at this from a different perspective in the here and now, aren't we? We live in a world where if you wanted to play Final Fantasy X in HD, you can do that very easily with the HD collection or emulation. Either way will give you an experience that essentially deletes everything I just talked about. Pushing a game's resolution up often reveals some of the pitfalls of the visual design when exposed, though. Simple geometry, skyboxes that clearly wrap around the world in obvious ways, and elements that were never meant to be seen in such crispness or in a widescreen format being revealed unceremoniously. PS2 games in general don't respond well to the HD treatment across the board because it reveals so many more faults of the console's general aesthetic. It's not to say that it looks bad though, it's that it specifically reveals a little too much about what we're looking at a lot of the time. But if we lower the resolution and add that subtle smoothing layer to the image, we get something that hides what it needs to hide while showing us everything we need to see. and that creates beautiful little moments like this. The salvage ship is an area you spend roughly 5 minutes on. It's where you first meet Riku and learn that Tidus has been sent forward 1,000 years into the future. At this point, it's where some of the puzzle pieces may start forming in your head about where this story could go. But for now, Tidus is isolated from home and essentially lost at sea. It's pretty subtle, I know. But the lighting of this moment with the skybox just slightly letting in the last vestiges of the sun is awe-inspiring. It's an extremely poignant moment to me because I don't think any game has quite nailed the lighting of Twilight like this. In fact, I vividly remember playing Final Fantasy X for the first time on a summer night a couple years back and getting to this area with the lights off and the dim screen ahead of me being the only light source around. And let me tell you, that was an experience. I don't think any game has really captured the visual essence, the pure visual essence of Twilight before. Not even the game that's all about that shit. There's also the sunset at Killiko, which, I mean, we could just end the video right here. I'd happily just have the next 10 minutes be devoted to this shot, right? It's incredible. It's incredible. Not only is this whole scene stunning, but we also get arguably the most beautiful scene in the whole game of Yuna sending the spirits of people that have just been killed by sin. It's a scene that's balancing the heartache of those in mourning while showcasing the sheer amazement and beauty of life itself, the warmth of the fading sun, Yuna gathering the souls of the deceased, and everyone watching in sheer awe. Perfection. Aesthetically, other than the idea of tropical mourning time, I like to say that Final Fantasy X's visual style is true to life. Not realistic per se, because 10 is definitely stylized in a certain way, but all of the little touches, details, lighting, and ambience is constructed to make Final Fantasy X feel as true to life as possible. It's all in service to making Spira feel like a truly lived-in world through and through. And while we're here, we also need to look at inspirations, because Final Fantasy X's world is composed of lots of unique stuff in this regard, which feeds into tropical mourning time even more. The game was put together with an Asian aesthetic design intent. This came about from the development team noticing that fantasy games at the time rarely strayed away from Western-styled settings, and there wasn't a desire to return to the types of worlds found in classic Final Fantasy titles. This in itself isn't a very focused aesthetic due to the huge variance in cultures and religions and visual palettes, but this is sort of the point. Spira is a world that is also composed of different subcultures and belief systems. Cultures that have existed and developed over more than 1,000 years and had to constantly rebuild themselves and strengthen their faith in Yevon as sin's destruction reared its head every 10 years or so. This is not a story recap though, so we're gonna just quickly move on and get to the juicy parts of the game. So Final Fantasy X's world is entirely shaped around death, and we see how it affects Spira's culture. But it's the way that these ideas reverberate into the wider game through the tone and subtly somber vibe that really clicks for me. 10 does not go out of its way to be overtly sad or try to squeeze as many tears out of you as it can. Even though Spira has had to deal with sin in some form for so long, you still see a certain spark of life rear its head. Whether that be through Blitzball, attempts to fight sin without the use of the final Aeon, or simply appreciating life one day at a time. But every so often, the characters do let some of those darker feelings settle in a little bit. In fact, it's this very moment that Final Fantasy X decides to open on, with all the characters joined around a campfire before they travel into the heart of Zanarkand. Not a single word is spoken between them in this scene, but you can infer nearly every thought that's going into their heads once you reach this point in the story. The idea that Yuna might have to sacrifice herself to delay Sin's destruction of Spira for a few more years riddles this moment with an angst that feels effortless. All the while, the aesthetic hallmarks of Final Fantasy X that we've talked about so far are present. The warm and soothing color palette and the little details in the distance alluding to the scale of the world beyond make the presentation of the scene very comfortable to watch, but balancing that with the dour content of the story at this point gives it that contrasting edge, which is exactly what Tropical Mourning Time is all about. Alright, Alright, I want to wrap up this video with some kind of final word regarding the tropical morning time aesthetic in hopes that I can clearly define it in some kind of way. Tropical morning at its core is a mixture of idyllic tropical sights and motifs alongside darker, more personal concepts that touch on bigger and loftier ideas. It's an aesthetic that takes very distinguishable settings and sights and uses them to tell stories that are much more complicated than you might expect, be it thematically or texturally, taking the things that we would associate as being relaxing or scenic and warping them to suit a narrative that strikes against those features. And this is something that I feel works best on the PS2 or graphics from this specific window of time, because it's a console that bridges the gap between gritty realism and artistic interpretation. The games that do sort of bridge this very undefined and hazy gap that manage to fulfill the criteria of tropical morning time too are able to utilize this weird point in gaming visual history and create something profoundly interesting. We could throw other buzzwords like nostalgic, dreamlike, or even liminal in some instances, but it's hard to generalize aesthetics like that, and once you start going down that path, I think we run the risk of taking aesthetics and smushing them so hard into that box, they sort of turn into nothing. Which is why I view tropical morning time to be pretty easy to define. Does it have a beach? Does the beach look cool? Does the game try to make me feel sad sometimes? Then it's probably a tropical morning time game. Examples of other games that fit this vibe obviously include Kingdom Hearts, which does get pretty damn close to the feelings I've described so far in this video. In some ways, taking them a couple steps further and evolving the nostalgic and relatable qualities of tropical morning time and applying them to the anxiety of summer vacations gone by. There's also a huge amount of Sega's video game library that accidentally falls into this camp. I mentioned Sonic Adventure earlier, and yeah, there are definitely shots in that game that bring about the same nostalgic feelings as Final Fantasy X does for me. And you know what? Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines also kind of fits in tonally, weirdly enough. If I end up experiencing some more games that fulfill the moods that fit into tropical morning time in my mind, maybe we'll revisit this idea and make a more comprehensive list. But there's never really going to be a game that handles this quite like Final Fantasy X, and that's okay.